Hello, this is Sondra Oster Baras bringing you a few words of Bible from the heart of Biblical Israel. This week's Torah portion is Shemot, and with this Torah portion we begin the book of Exodus. Now, the book of Genesis ended with the presence of the children of Israel, of Jacob, the children of Jacob, in Egypt. At the very end of the book, we learn that Joseph dies. We learn his story. We learn there's just sort of a summing up of the brothers and the fact that they end their lives in Egypt. And it's the end of the story. The book of Exodus begins, in a way, the first few verses are a recap of something we already know from Genesis. These are the names of the children or the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. Jacob himself and his household came. Now we have a very similar verse at the end of Genesis in chapter 46. And this actually is told in real time when they actually arrive. The whole family comes to Egypt and they actually arrive. And there it says almost the same thing. These are the names of the children or the sons of Israel who came to Egypt, Jacob and his sons. Jacob's firstborn is Reuben. First of all, we see right away that the difference is, whereas in the first verse in Exodus, we learn it's Jacob himself and his household. In this very first verse in chapter 46, verse 8, this verse itself, the beginning starts off very similar. These are the names of the sons of Jacob. But then the end of it already begins, instead of saying Jacob himself and his household, it's Jacob and his sons. And immediately in that same verse, we begin with the name of the first son, Reuben, who is the firstborn of Jacob. And the verses continue quite some time here in Exodus, listing the names of all the people, all the descendants of Jacob. In other words, his sons and his grandchildren who actually came to Egypt. We get all of their names, and at the end, we have a sum up that there were 70 of them. At the beginning of Exodus, it is very different. We have, after that, in that first verse where it says Jacob and his household, we then have just a list of his actual sons, and then we have the final total. The number of people that were descendants of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70, and Joseph was already in Egypt. Okay? And then the very next verse, Jacob died, all his brothers died, and that entire generation died out. And this little section ends, and the children of Israel were fruitful, multiplied, and we have many, many, many different verbs here, quite 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different verbs of the fact that they multiplied, they grew, they're filling up the land very much. And of course, right after that, we begin with the story of the enslavement of the children of Israel in Egypt. So first of all, I think just by comparing these two different verses that are so similar and then what they each develop into, we already get a sense of the huge difference between the description of the descent to Egypt in Genesis and the description in Exodus. In Genesis, we immediately have a list of all those people coming. You get the sense of a regal procession. Picture, this whole mass of family coming. And who are they? They are the family of the second in command of Egypt, of the prince of Egypt, Joseph. Okay, he is this amazing, high-powered person, and this entire procession of family members come, and that is the tone of the description in Genesis, a regal, celebratory description and procession. Here in Exodus, it is much more limited, because here we are just talking about the names of the children, and we said, and there were 70. There's nothing regal or celebratory about this description. On the contrary, this is the description that leads us in to the enslavement. And the very last verse of this section tells us they multiplied. And we're going to learn right after this, just a few verses later, that the king of Egypt is feeling threatened by the multiplying of this nation of Israel. And so begins the decrees and the enslavement of the nation of Israel. Now, I'd like to focus on just one little story here at the beginning in chapter 1 in Exodus, the story of the midwives. Okay, now this is, of course, Pharaoh has a number of different plans. Not all of them succeed, thank God, to try to get rid of, to destroy the nation. And one of his plans is to kill all the children, okay, to kill the boys, all right? And so the way he does that initially is he gives a commandment to the midwives. And he says, when you are helping the Jewish women or the Hebrew women give birth, if it's a daughter, let her live. If it's a boy, kill him. So he asked the midwives to kill babies. And these are midwives. What do midwives do? Midwives bring life into the world. They help women give birth. They do everything they can to save the life of the baby, to save the life of the mother. And here he's turning to those very same people and asking them to kill babies. So first of all, you could say he's a little daft. I mean, I can understand giving that same order to your soldiers or your policemen, which is what he ends up doing. But to give this kind of an order to the midwives, why does he think they will cooperate? Okay, now there's actually a very interesting question that arises here, because in verse 15, it says, and the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives. Okay, now this verse, and I'll say it in Hebrew, la milyardot ha'ivriot, literally the Hebrew midwives. But one of the questions that arises here is, not only is Pharaoh daft if he thinks that midwives who usually save life are going to be the ones who are going to kill babies, but why would he say that to women who themselves are part of the children of Israel? And therefore, there are people who read this verse differently and who say it is not the Hebrew midwives, it is the midwives who give birth or who assist the birth of the Hebrews. And it is possible to read in Hebrew, it is possible to read those words in that way. In other words, it can either mean Hebrew midwives or it can mean the midwives of the Hebrews. And if they're the midwives of the Hebrews, it's very possible that they are not themselves of the children of Israel, that they are Egyptian women. In which case, it makes sense that Pharaoh would see them as his allies. He doesn't think of them as women who save lives. He just thinks of them as Egyptians. And the way he has set things up, the way he views, as he says, here's this nation among us that is growing and threatening us, okay? He has set things up as a dichotomy. The Egyptians on one side, the children of Israel on the other, and he has, assuming that he is going to be able to gather the entire Egyptian nation behind him in order to enslave and persecute the Hebrews, the children of Israel. If we read it that these women are indeed Egyptians themselves, then their response is all the more amazing and heroic. Okay? And so what does it say in verse 17? The midwives feared God, and therefore they did not do what Pharaoh asked of them, and they allowed these children to live. And of course, then he accuses them, and they just said, and they give an excuse, okay? But imagine who these women are. If these women are children of Israel, the fact that they fear God is not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal, but it's part of the family tradition, okay? And then the fact that they are going to try to avoid obeying Pharaoh is also obvious, because they're going to do what they can. Who are they helping to give birth? Their sisters, their cousins, their neighbors, okay? But if these women are indeed Egyptian women, and for some reason they find a way to trust and believe in God, they are following a moral compass different than the rest of the Egyptian nation. And they stand up to Pharaoh and say, no, we will not kill these babies. What amazing women these are. And these women, I see them as joining a chain of women that we see in the Bible. Women who are not from the nation of Israel. Women like Rahab. Women like Yael, who, for whatever, because they fear God, and it's stated very clearly in all of those examples, because they fear God, because they have witnessed God's miracles, they look around them and they say, we cannot stand with our natural allies. We must ally ourselves with the nation of Israel. Thank God today we are seeing so many examples of men and women of the nations who fear God and therefore ally themselves with Israel. Have a wonderful weekend. Shabbat Shalom.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.